So, question was land ordinances. Plural. So for the land ordinances, the only thing that you really need to know to walk away from, there are a series of them. There's more than one land ordinance. Usually the most popular land ordinance is the Northwest Ordinance. Remember, Northwest at this time is not Oregon and Washington. Northwest at this time is like Ohio, okay? The main thing is that this is a positive aspect of like the Articles of Confederation Congress under the Articles, and I'll post this on Canvas too, the notes. Positive aspect under the Articles of Confederation, because most of it pretty much is terrible, right? They pretty much scrapped the Articles of Confederation. It's a positive aspect, like the only thing positive that happened under the Articles of Confederation would be the land ordinances. The purpose was for organized settlement west. And so, for example, cities and towns, areas were actually drawn in a grid-like pattern. So that it looks, I mean, if we were to go to Google, for example, and just pull up the Northwest Ordinance and maybe look up images. You kind of see the area, but that's kind of what you're looking at. Let's see, probably right here. So you've got one township here, how it's really well sorted. Do you see how it's like a grid-like pattern? That way you can organize westward settlement, and people can get there and it'd be organized. They could get land that they need, that kind of thing. Does that help? Okay, so it was a positive aspect, and it was successful for the land ordinance. Anything else that you can think of that you might have questions about? All right, go ahead, Drew.
Diplomatic failure statement.
So, let me grab a Brinkley text. Brinkley.
A Brinkley text, and the copy of it is somewhere. Over here. It was, where did the Brinkley text?
All right, $5. Somebody can find our Brinkley tax. Oh, it's over here beside the computer. Where I put it on purpose. Okay, so if you'll go to Brinkley, it's chapter 5. I think it's chapter 5. And let's see. Chapter 6. So that's on page 135. That's where I was going with that. All right. So the problem with that, it says Confederation diplomats agreed to a treaty with Spain in 1786, accepted the American interpretation of the Florida boundary. In return, Americans recognized the Spanish possessions in North America and accepted limits on the rights of the United States vessels to navigate the Mississippi for 20 years. So that doesn't really sound all that bad. So there's a treaty recognized the Florida boundary, and in exchange for U.S. vessels navigate Mississippi River for 20 years. You don't really need to know 20 years, but there's that. But southern states incensed at the idea of giving up their access to the Mississippi. So it was limited access. So southern states are upset. So if you're going to make some connections, for example, You can make some connections to, I don't know, you can make some connections like the Whiskey Rebellion, because that's your farmers out west. Are upset, okay, at government policies, for example. You could also, the Adams-Onis Treaty, you can make a connection with that where eventually Florida is gained by the United States, right? So you can make that as a treaty too, and I think that is, let me double check the year. I thought it was 1820, sorry, it's 1819. Okay. All right, so there's some of that, okay? So that's, it's not really necessarily a diplomatic failure, but not everybody's happy about it. Okay. What else?
The British diplomatic failures.
Okay. Dip failures with British. So that's going to be on the same page. So, and it's kind of pretty big. So, you're looking at post-Treaty of Paris, and so there's a problem. Like, even though there were boundaries that were established, and this is talking about this in the first paragraph, the problem is that the Treaty of Paris, and that's post-American Revolution, was to recognize the boundaries of America, but of course the British still had troops in the area, and pretty much I guess you could say they like didn't always honor those boundaries pretty much, and there were a lot of disputes that happened about the borders. So this eventually, by the way, is going to be one of the causes of the War of 1812. So there's that. There's also a dispute over trade as well, which is also linked to the War of 1812. We tried to establish like peaceful relationships with Great Britain, but they don't work. Inability to establish like diplomatic relationships. I mean, the British were still kind of ticked at us. As a matter of fact, to go back to the War of 1812 again, the War of 1812 is also known as America's Second War for Independence, because of how the British are treating us in terms of trade, and we're not able to do things freely, then it becomes very problematic for us. And so that's a series of other actions then cause us to enter into the War of 1812. Okay, Drew, go ahead.
Where are these border disputes?
The border disputes are Canada border region, like Great Lakes area. Another question? You think you can kind of find all the terms? The terms should not be much of a problem, right? I hope not. So do you want to look at like some sample questions? We could do that. All right. Let's see. AP U.S. History, Period 3. Sample questions? Practice questions. Let's do practice questions. Practice test. Let's do practice test. That'll be good. Okay. Okay, so this is Gilder Lehrman. Let's see how you are in terms of This? Okay. So, can you see that? I can make it bigger. All right. So let's take a look at it. The excerpt, again, one of the strategies that I would do if I'm taking time to test, don't read that excerpt first. You read the question, that way you read with a purpose when you read the excerpt. So the excerpt most directly reflects which of the following goals for England's North American colonies. So you're looking at the excerpt, goals for England's North American colonies. Let's see, being enacted that after the 5 and 20 days March 1698 no goods or merchandises whatsoever shall be imported to, exported, any colony or plantation to His Majesty, Asia, Africa, America, in any ship or bottom, but what is or shall be built of England, Ireland, said colonies, plantations navigated with the masters and 3/4 of the mariners of the said places only, under pain of forfeiture of ships and goods. Navigation Act, 1696. All right. Developing them as producer or manufacturer goods, aiding them in developing trade with other European nations, integrating them into a coherent imperial structure based on mercantilism, protecting them from American Indian tax. Which one is obviously not true? Okay, good. D, not true. So A, B, or C? So here's what you're looking for in the passage. The date may be important, but not entirely. Goods or merchandises shall be imported or exported out of any colony or plantation to His Majesty in Asia, Africa, or America. So are they trying to aid them in trading with other European nations? No, and you should also know in terms of the Navigation Acts, they were passed to facilitate trade between the colonies and Great Britain. So it should be either A or C. So which one is it? Which one is it? C? Well, let's see if it's C. Oh my goodness, you guys are so smart. All right.
Mister, I have a question about the navigation.
Okay, go.
So are they also a cause of the 1812 war because they weren't?
Not really. The Navigation Acts are not really a cause of the War of 1812 directly. I mean, indirectly, you could probably make the case that perhaps the underlying cause of why Great Britain passed those Navigation Acts was still an underlying issue with Great Britain, because they just lost a really powerful group of colonies that were really important for them in terms of economics. So, I mean, in a very indirect underlying way, you might could do that. Okay, direct long-term effect of the Navigation Act. It promoted commercial treaties with Spain and France throughout the 1700s. Contributed to the rise of opposition that ultimately fostered the independence movement. Encouraged colonists in North America to expand trade agreements with American Indians. Led to imposition of heavy taxes on North American colonists in the early 1700s. Can we mark out one or two? C, because what's up with the Indians? And which other one? Maybe A? What do you think the answer is? What was it? D? Anybody agree or disagree? Huh? Agree for D? D? Oh.
B.
Okay. Yeah, B. So remember the imposition of the Navigation Acts. You have this problem in the colonies. I mean, they don't mind paying taxes, but the problem is that also are the Navigation Acts strictly enforced? Nope. You should be thinking of salutary neglect. Okay. Let's take a look at another one. Okay. The goals presented in the excerpt from the Act have the most in common with which of the following? So the goals. So what are, like, remember the goals? The goals are like trade with Great Britain, that kind of thing from the Navigation Acts from the excerpt. Have the most in common with increases of the federal tariff in the 1820s. Oh, poo, we haven't studied that. Progressive era antitrust reforms in the 1900s. Oh, man, we haven't studied that either. Free trade policies in the 1990s. We've not studied that. Federal tax reductions in the 2000s. We've not studied that either. But do you think that you might be able to consider possibly one of these answer choices?
Yeah.
Which one is it? C? A? C? A? Which one? C? Hold your breath.
Oh.
Oh. Okay. So I thought maybe I didn't know. Increases in the federal tariff of 1820s. Of course, you know we had that would not be a test question you would have now, but it could be in your next unit. Just saying. The later called the tariff of abomination. So you guys, of course, have probably already talked about that in your president's pages. Increased the tax on imported manufactured goods. So the law economically benefited the North. So you are looking at like benefiting one region with your tariffs. Okay, let's take a look at another one. Okay, bye. I'll put this on Canvas.
Okay, thank you.
And I know you're gonna love to watch this. So bye. Okay. So let's see. That's not even part of our time period. Let's see if there's another one. Nope. How many questions are there? Okay, probably going to go in order, so we'll go back and look at something else. And yeah, okay. Oop, forward. Okay, so let's take a look. Let me scroll through this really quickly and take a look at the released test from AP. Really, very seriously, the first place I would probably look is this, because I do indeed use a lot of these, or a variation of these, because we did put these on there. Remember these, let's see, where are the excerpts? There's some over here somewhere. We've used some of these. Let's see, where is it? Let's start up at the top. Really quickly, just to scroll through. So remember, we did like George Whitefield. We've done those already. But it doesn't really look like, I think it pretty much skips the American Revolution, which I think is kind of weird that it does that. Oh, here we go. Here's one. The excerpt was written in response to the, so here's right here, Thomas Jefferson Declaration of Independence. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's right of the government, right of the people to alter, abolish, and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, organizing powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So is this excerpt written in response to the British attempt to assert greater control over the North American colonies, failure to protect the colonies from attacks by Indians, colonial governments' failures to implement mercantilist policies, or colonial attempts to extend political rights to new groups? What would you choose for that answer if it happened to be on your test? Which one? D? Okay, why?
Because it's based, Thomas Jefferson basically saying that we should change our government into a republic, and that if it violates the rights of people, then we should abolish it, and people should have the same government. So basically, like popular tolerance.
So how is that extending political rights to new groups?
I agree with it until that part. Like I don't get the whole new group thing. It's the same group of people. I mean, except for like, I mean, they are independent and they're their own like state now. I mean,
Okay.
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I don't get how. I just don't get that.
Maybe like the people from England have never had rights like that.
Okay.
So a government like that.
But have they? I mean, haven't we talked about John Locke, for example, John Locke saying that it is your government's right to alter, abolish. It is your right to alter, abolish government if they don't protect your rights. Yeah, we talked about that. Anybody else agree or disagree? What do you think, Daphne?
I actually think it's A because the thing it says it's a response to not what it's asking for.
Okay, yeah, you got to read the question for that too. The excerpt is written in response to. So in other words, what would cause Thomas Jefferson to write this part? 'Cause-
That makes more sense.
okay. All right, well, let's take a look. That's number 10, right? Lucky for us, it's got the answer key down here somewhere. I always check mine just to be sure. All right, where is it? It's down here somewhere. Number 10. It is A. Good job. Okay. So be sure, and we just talked about this actually also in civics. I mean, that's pretty important that you're reading the question for what it's asking, not just a right answer. That's what I've usually noticed about your AP test questions. There's like two answer choices that are right. One of them is right for the question. Have you noticed that? Or sometimes three of them. Okay, so this other one too, the ideas about government expressed in the excerpt are most consistent with which of the following? So is it the concept of hereditary rights and privileges, manifest destiny, religious freedom, or ideas of the Enlightenment? And so it's asking again, ideas about government expressed in the excerpt are most consistent with which? So you think it's either A or D? So what can you absolutely mark out?
B and C.
Yeah, manifest destiny doesn't happen yet, and we haven't studied that. So right now you might not know that, but C is the principle of religious freedom. So is it consistent with religious freedom? Well, I mean, only if you were starting to read into it, you might think, well, if the government's not protecting your right to religious freedom, maybe so. But that's not really what the question is asking. It says the ideas of government expressed in the excerpt are most consistent. So you have to think about ideas about government's purpose. So what is government's purpose? Like, why do we have that?
Well, I think that goes along with the Enlightenment because that's when they like question like, is this just? Like, is this?
Right, because the whole point of the Enlightenment was, of course, questioning, government. It's kind of pulling away from just accepting this establishment, so to speak, and beginning to question that. Okay.
Too specific.
Yeah, and I mean it would negatively address like hereditary rights and privileges. Like you don't want that for government. So I see what you're saying there. So taking a look again, answer key, really quickly. Number 11, D.
Alexander Chavez, if you're in the building, please go to the media center. Alexander Chavez, if you're in the building, please go to
The ideas of the Enlightenment. All right, good. All right, anything else? I don't think so. That's probably about as many as what we would find in here. Yeah.
Could you go over what's the name of the church you like this miracle of me?
Yeah, like can we talk more like about that, like the important, like you made the test, correct?
I made the questions that go on the test. Totally stole
Yeah,
them.
but like the key points you focused on
Okay.
on the test.
Oh, Mr. I have a question about like the vocab and stuff. Those two. So like when I'm taking notes, and like a lot of those things are in the bigger text, so could I just like highlight like the vocab that I come across? Yeah. Just turn that on.
On your book?
Huh?
In your book?
No, not in the book. But like when I'm taking notes.
Yeah, it'll be fine.
And just
Because
turn
you're-
all my notes.
Yeah, because I mean that's essentially what I tried to do with this is to get it all in one, where you didn't have to do notes and flashcards and mind maps and an assignment. So does that make sense? But Anna, be aware that you'll have to add other stuff because there's
Yeah.
other stuff in here that's not in the text on some of them.
Oh.
Okay. All right. So then let's plow through it like this. All right. So let's do causes. That's like the first assignment. Causes and people of the American Revolution. All right. So how do you go about studying this? Mnemonic devices are helpful if you can kind of remember that, because I mean, is it helpful to know dates? Yes, it is. Okay, it is helpful to know dates. But you have to think about it big picture. So I think if you could look at the big picture, and step back and see the big things that are happening. If you get a question, and maybe perhaps you don't remember who George Grenville is, but if you know the general dates and time periods, that's a pretty big deal. So some of those game changers are like 1754 to 1763. What's going on there? The French and Indian War, right? Yeah.
Is that called the 7 Years' War in Great Britain?
Yeah, it depends on where you're looking at. Like the 7 Years' War, as it plays out in America, is called the French and Indian War. It's really weird because all of those wars are fought between either like Great Britain and France and Great Britain and Spain. And it's all over the world. I mean, and that's of course salutary neglect, right? So you connect salutary neglect to that. So what happens with salutary neglect? Salutary neglect allows the colonies to grow independent. I mean, it's basically a communication problem. Like while Great Britain wasn't looking, the colonies grow up. They're doing their own thing. They don't communicate well. They have different ideas now about representation, for example. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, pretty big game changer. Also, we talked about like direct versus indirect taxation, direct/internal versus indirect/external taxes. That would be the Stamp Act. Maybe I should do them backwards because that's coming first. So let me do that. Paste. So your internal tax, your indirect or your external taxes are like your Sugar Act. Okay, so the Sugar Act is not such a big deal in terms of paying that kind of duty, is what it's called, on trade. That's all the Sugar Act is. But of course, the British lower the tax, trying to stop smuggling, trying to get the colonists to pay for this. But the problem is it's not what you tax, it's why you tax it. So it's supposed to pay for the war. And that's basically what the British are saying. The colonies are not happy about it, but they're not even close to be ready for rebellion. And you're talking about the 1760s. And then, of course, you've got the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is not only designed to pay for war, but that's a direct tax. It's happening on what's going on inside the colonies. Like, really, this is the only attempt by Great Britain at this point to tax what's going on inside of the colonies. Otherwise, they back up, because after, of course, the Stamp Act Congress, no taxation without representation, Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams, trying to take off the governor's roof of his house. I mean, stamping on the effigy of Andrew Oliver. I mean, there's a lot of things going on with protests and boycotts that are going to be successful for the colonists. Okay, so you have to look at it from the British perspective and from the colonist perspective. The colonists are not ready for war. We're talking about, like, for example, here, time period 1765. But it is a game changer. All right? The Stamp Act is a game changer because it makes really the Sons of Liberty, liberty.
Miss, I have practice so I have to go.
But
But you're
okay.
going to put all of this on campus, right?
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. So, Sons of Liberty, they're going to be really active. In their protests and their boycott. It's going to be successful. It's not like the British are just trying to lay the smackdown on and be mean to them. They're actually trying to get this war paid for because wars are expensive. Okay? So then when you proceed into that, and that's why, I can't go over every single thing, but there's a progression of what the British are doing. So they're trying to work with the colonies to a certain extent, but they're still the parent country. I mean, the things like the Quartering Act and the writs of assistance, it's going to really involve, the British soldiers. I mean, that's like trying to kill a mosquito with a bazooka because you're sending in the military, and the colonists are not going to respond well to that. And there was one guy in Parliament who even said about the Stamp Act, colonists are probably not going to like that. But he's like the only guy that, the rest of them couldn't figure out, why would the colonists not pay this? That's ridiculous. I mean, we pay stuff like that all the time. They're colonists, that's why. They've grown up, they've grown independent, so it's a big problem, okay? Some of the other big game changers, of course, after the Stamp Act was repealed, you got the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Acts, you got the Boston Massacre. That's another big game changer. And that's going to be like 1770. And so that's going to repeal a lot of the Townshend Acts except the one on tea. Then you, of course, are going to have the Boston Tea Party, the Tea Act. And so that's, again, going to be a big game changer because you have the Intolerable Acts. So one of the reactions, like the First Continental Congress, you're looking at 1774, okay? So is anyone suggesting independence in 1774? Yes, and the radical crazies and the Sons of Liberty, stuff like that. So there's some suggestions about that, but most people are not on board with independence, even though they're discussing, like, what are some of the problems with the Intolerable Acts, okay? Drew, go ahead.
I understand why Intolerable Acts happen, but like, what is it?
Probably the two main things to remember from the Intolerable Acts that I've seen, closing down the Boston Harbor until the tea is paid for. It's an economic issue for the colonists, but despite the fact that even Great Britain might suffer from that because you're shutting down a lucrative harbor, the British are willing to take that as a hit, flat out. And on top of that, they take away the Massachusetts people's right to self-govern.
That was basically just punishing Massachusetts, right? It didn't really affect any other colonies.
Why was it just Massachusetts?
Because of the Boston Tea Party. And that's really where they're most active. And that's why the First Continental Congress, not all the colonies, like Georgia sits it out, like not interested in that going there. So Lexington and Concord is also a big game changer. It's the first battle of the American Revolution. So you're talking about, 1775, first battle. With Lexington and Concord, the result for that is a Second Continental Congress. And so with that, the colonists are going to try the Olive Branch Petition one more time to try to make peace. I mean, you're still trying to reconcile with Great Britain, okay? But King George says, no, you got your rebels. I mean, doesn't even bother to respond to them. So with that, you have Thomas Paine, Common Sense. His writing in 1770, I think his is 1776, is going to encourage people to get on board with the idea of independence. And of course, that's going to lead us to the Declaration of Independence. So you also have to look at how, one of the other things that we were looking at is like the different groups that are impacted, women, Native Americans, for example. On your paper, on the second assignment, let's see, we talked about that. Let's see, let me find it. Third assignment, and African Americans, of course. So there's going to be some gradual emancipation in the North for African Americans, but there's still some slavery that's happening in the North. The Native Americans, of course, they're going to be relegated to reservations and, of course, continue not to be treated well by our government, especially the new government. Women, Republican motherhood. Do you remember what Republican motherhood is? Mm-hmm. So you're trying to raise, good citizens as wives and mothers. I mean, that's kind of what you're doing. That's your role. There's no real rights for women, unfortunately. So we've got the ideals of revolution. So, like John Locke, his social contract theory. Even we approach the Great Awakening and John Winthrop's a model of Christian charity. So this whole idea of us being based on a Christian nation, there is truth in that in terms of looking at why Congress, mints coins with "In God We Trust" on them. And basically the courts have said, well, it's connected to our ideas on freedom and liberty. In terms of our early history. So that's why we still get to keep "In God We Trust" on coins, and it's still accepted as part of our history. Also, like the Declaration of Independence, I mean, we see that appear again, most specifically with, I always throw that out with the Declaration of Sentiments for women's rights, because they really do get on board with all men are created equal. Well, don't you mean women too? And so that's repurposed again later on. Okay. Let's see. Any other questions about those? I mean, for the battles, the main ones that I always toss out, Lexington and Concord, Saratoga gets the French on board, and Yorktown, which is the end of the American Revolution. Those are always the three that keep appearing over and over, but the other ones are also in your book as well. and on other AP exams. So there's that. Let's see. No, there's nothing on besides alluding to how the American Revolution impacted the Native Americans. There's nothing about, pre-Columbian era. So there's nothing there on the Mayans or the Aztecs.
Be quiet.
Sorry.
Please.
Just want to throw that out there. State constitutions. And the only thing colonial that's on there is about leading up to American Revolution, like mercantilism, for example, salutary neglect, navigation acts. That's really where this picks up from. Let's see. So once we are free and independent, and I hate that we didn't get to read the Declaration of Independence very specifically, considering how much I love Thomas Jefferson. But we have state constitutions that are formed. It's really, really important for us at this point to understand that state constitutions are formed first. Because the problem we're going to get into in our early government, the whole issue is about who has more power, states or the federal government. So states say they're formed first, they should be able to have more power. And that gets us, for example, state or federal, that gets us into this whole complication of, well, why in the world do state constitutions, where are they formed with 3 branches of government? But you have the Articles. How many branches does the Articles of Confederation have? 1. It's the legislative branch. So what the heck's up with that? It goes to show you how freaked out we are early on in our history about having an executive. Go ahead, Anna.
What was the post-revolution depression? That was
Post-revolution
like, was it just social justice?
depression. Where was it in Brinkley? Do you know? Can you find it?
It was like on the timeline.
Post-revolution depression. I mean, there is a big issue about paying for, because wars are expensive. So I don't know if you mean like economic depression.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Okay. Yeah, it's mainly because you have to pay for the American Revolution, and that, if you're talking about an economic depression in that case for that question, that's going to lead us into a discussion on Shays' Rebellion. So here's this Massachusetts farmer. He's going to lose his land because Massachusetts has to pay, a lot, because a lot of stuff happened in Massachusetts. But then, the problem with that, when you look at it, but all the 13 states now have freedom, so why doesn't everybody have to pay then equitably? Well, then, of course, Daniel Shays is going to lead a rebellion, and that's going to signal the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Like, we need to do something where we have a stronger federal government, which is Federalists and Anti-Federalists, okay? Which leads us into the development of first political parties, Federalists and Democrat Republicans. Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson. Okay. All right. Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. So that leads us into that. And that's really, like, Shays' Rebellion is really kind of where we're going to stop with the test. But state constitutions themselves, so federalism and republicanism are out there. So, I mean, your federalism is, okay, really who has more power? State constitutions or the federal government. And coming back up here, throwing this out as well, right up here, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, you're trying to nullify a federal law. The Alien and Sedition Acts, those are going to try to target, really they're trying to target support for Democrat Republicans. Okay? So, I mean, you get into that with state versus federal government. So you can do weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. That's the Venn diagram. I mean, that just gives you some really good notes, okay? So the Articles of Confederation really can't do a whole lot. And one of the reasons we even have the Articles of Confederation is because the states recognize the fact that we need to form some sort of military. Why? Because we just got out of a war. So having a military is probably a good idea. You think about it logically, like if you're a country and you become independent, first thing you need is working government. Then you need to protect yourself. So then those are the steps we go through. Okay?
Did you just explain Shays Rebellion?
I think I did. Do you want me to do it again? Yeah. So Shays Rebellion, because there's a lot of stuff going on economically. So after the American Revolution, there's a lot of war debt. And so there are some problems with that. Massachusetts is going to pay the brunt of that because a lot of stuff happens again in Massachusetts. Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord. So the problem with that after we win the American Revolution is that Daniel Shays is going to lose his farm because of that. And he knows that that's just not right. I mean, he's a fighter. He is a soldier in the American Revolution. He should not have to lose his land. Especially when you could equitably distribute this war debt among all the colonies. Like, why isn't Georgia paying some on that? I mean, you don't see that happening in Georgia. They're free too. So there's a problem. So he leads this rebellion to try to prevent his house from like being taken by the Massachusetts state government. That, of course, makes news in the colonies, and the problem is that it signals the fact that you've got a weak federal government that can't equally and equitably distribute what they need to. Now, eventually, we do get into the forming of it like a national bank. One of the reasons we have a national bank is to organize to pay for a war debt like this. But the big thing at the time for Shays Rebellion is that the Articles of Confederation isn't going to work so well.
That's because like they couldn't tax like every state
Yeah, I mean, they basically had to rely on states
voluntarily.
to give us some but why did we even do that? Because we came out of tyranny and oppression in terms of looking at this from Great Britain, the American Revolution. Daphne?
And there was no federal court at the time, right? So they can
There wasn't a federal court. No, there wasn't. I mean- Uh-huh.
So what were the first parties? Like they were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists,
The first parties?
right? Yeah.
Okay.
Like,
So
where did the
technically not parties because Federalists and Anti-Federalists are debating over the Constitution
yeah.
and how the Constitution should be structured. So we really didn't even have like a serious working government at that time. So they're actually called factions.
I
And
remember
then-
that. That's it.
The Democratic Republic, like, what are they now? Because that all confuses me.
It is a little confusing. So really the main topic that divides people today is how much power should the federal government have. Okay? So the main division that happens, the Federalists believe in creating a stronger federal government, but creating one that will not be tyrannical. The Democrat Republicans are much more skeptical about that. They believe in smaller federal government, more state government's power. So just in that respect, they're similar to Democrat Republicans to today's Republicans and Federalists to today's Democrats. Because, the Democrats believe, a bigger federal government actually provides more equity in your life. But Republicans believe that, leave that to the states and let them deal with the needs of their own specific people since we're such a big country and everybody has different needs. So, I mean, but the end goal is the same in terms of equity and meeting people's needs, but just how you get there is different.
But most people in that time period were Democratic Republicans.
In this time
Like, yeah.
period, in terms of how many actually align themselves, I'm not sure. I do know their first government, like Washington, even though he didn't have a political party, he did favor the Federalists. But Adams was a total Federalist. And then you have the Revolution of 1800, which we actually stopped with period 3. And then our next unit, period 4, is going to pick up with Jeffersonian democracy.
Jefferson was the thing.
He was the man.
That's all I had to learn in civics school.
Yep, to pass. That's all you need to know. Daphne, what do you think?
well, the way that I remembered it in civics, you said that Federalists wanted one big blanket and that
Mhm.
the Democrat Republicans wanted a smaller blanket.
Yeah, like everybody gets their own blanket for the states for Republicans. The federal government wants just one giant warm blanket to snuggle everybody in. So, I don't know. Okay? Anything else? So, I mean, really, Juliana, I would love to be able to say, focus on one thing more so than the other. I guess if I could offer any advice about that is focus on the big picture. I mean, you know, you might not get every single question right, but if you know the big picture and you know some time periods, and everybody hates memorizing dates, but I mean, you know, it's important to understand, like 1783 is the Treaty of Paris, so that actually recognizes American independence. I mean, just stuff like that would be really helpful, okay?
Thank you.
Email me if you guys have any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Day.
You're welcome.